everybody. Welcome to the One Question Podcast, the podcast that brings together two Christians and a skeptic in conversation about the state of the world and what justice looks like in practice. Each episode returns to one core question: how do we move from words to action in ways that actually strengthen community? We unpack what's happening, name the forces behind it, and stay focused on what people can build together. I am your host, Matthew Brake, and as always, I'm joined by Muoki Masao.
What's going on?
And Jason Bayless.
Hello.
How you doing, fellas?
Pretty good.
Rough.
Rough. There's the real line. Rough, tired.
Man, those gas prices shot up to, at least for me in my areas, got up to $3.99 overnight, and that just was a tough one. So
$3.99. What? It's like $5, almost $6.
Yeah, but the cost of living though, that's the thing that it's still hard out here, man. So that jacked me up.
It's funny to talk about cost of living because, again, Jason living in California, it's like everything, like cost of living way more expensive.
It's insane.
I was out. It is funny now that I've gone out to Burbank a few times because one of my stepdaughters is out there, and now I'm just used to it. I'm like, oh yeah, no, of course gas is $5.99. Why wouldn't it be $5.99? Of course it is. And so no, I know Jason's living in a whole other world from us.
Damn you, Biden. No.
Yeah, thanks,
Right.
Thanks, Obama.
Thanks, Obama. Yeah, it always goes back to Obama.
Yeah, at some point, you really have to start blaming the guy in power. Which, speaking of critiquing people who are in power, one of the things we've been talking about, or really the thing we've been talking about for the past two episodes, has been the very premise of this podcast, which is this idea of two believers, me and Muoki, engaging in conversation with a skeptic, that would be Jason, about seeking justice together in the world. So our first episode, among other things, dealt with how do two believing people find common ground with a skeptic for seeking justice. And that is an issue for some Christian believing people because they think that there is nothing good outside of one's circle of fellow believers that one can learn from in terms of making the world a better place. Sometimes they might even think that it's silly to talk about making the world a better place. So we talked about some of the reasons why, our own imminent reasons why we see value in engaging with Jason. And then Jason came back the next episode and asked us some critical questions about dealing with the problem of using the divine to advocate for justice, because there are a lot of people who claim the name of God and the divine for a lot of things, for wars and rumors of wars and praying that God would slaughter others with no mercy, as happened recently here among our own Secretary of Defense. So, so he asked us some critical questions, but now we actually want to move to some of the meat of why we did this podcast together, which is talking about how do we do it? All right, we've talked about some of the reasons why we can engage in these conversations, but how do we actually seek justice and liberation and a better world together? So, Jason, I don't know if you want to take a minute, because part of this episode was inspired by a text you sent us about maybe moving from the philosophical and the abstract into some concrete action. So, go ahead and tell us what you're thinking.
Well, I think I'm going to throw it back to you after I say a couple of things, because we've set up a rhythm here where I send a text and say, hey, why don't we think about or talk about this? And then I set up the episode. So what I would like to turn it back onto you both and saying, well, how did those conversations land with you, and how do you want to move forward with this episode? Because just to reinforce what you've already said is, it was coming from a place of like, yeah, we've talked very high level. We've talked about the philosophical aspect. We pulled in great thinkers from both sides of the spectrum, and we talked about that and what that means within that context. But we've never broken out of that and saying, well, what does that look like, and how does that manifest in the world in the face of obvious oppression? not abstract, not as kind of hidden, but blatant oppression that is happening. And if we're committed to justice, how does our values that we pull from the philosophies and from observing the world around us, how does that manifest and show up for us? So that was the kind of the core of the text, but I'm going to stop and push it back onto you and see how it landed and reflected, so we can then build something from that.
Well, that's great. You know what I'm going to do is be like, what do you think, Muoki?
Great. Just great. So for thinking about like what have we done, what do we do? So after I got my seminary degrees, I worked at a college as a resident director, and then after that, while I was doing that, met my wife, and then shortly after we got married, and then I went out to Swaziland, now Eswatini, to do missionary work, which she was doing. And I'm not a Kool-Aid drinker when it comes to mission work. I don't just like, oh yeah, let's win the world for Jesus, and anything we do by saying that is good to like it's good to go. Because I say I'm gonna go win the world for Jesus and try and get as many people to hear the word as possible, that whatever I end up doing is justified. So, and also because when I was there, one of the things I learned very quickly is there are very few people of color, even when we're going to minister to a place like Eswatini, which is obviously an African country, so it's filled with black people. Also, there was this socioeconomic disparity where missionaries, the way that we raise funds is based on the cost of living in a Western context, not in a non-Western context, where if I was making the same amount of money relative to the people that I work with, I would not be trying to raise as much support as I needed. So all I'll say is like we had like bigger homes than everybody, even though we did the same work. So for me, I was like, okay, what I wanted to do was I was thinking to myself, okay, yeah, we're over here telling them like, serve God and all this, and confess your sins and live a morally upright life. But I'm like, but everybody is still poor. And to me, I was like, okay, what are we doing about that part? Because like Jason, you were talking about how charity essentially just perpetuates the system of poverty and just the economic disparity of the haves and have-nots. In fact, it increases that disparity. What I saw at the time was what we're doing is not accelerating the time where the people we're serving are not going to need us. That they're not going to need missionaries to come and Western countries to send clothes, send food, send money, send whatever. That, to me, when I was like, okay, I think that's what the end goal of missionary work is supposed to be. If you go there, make them self-sustaining so they don't need you anymore. To me, I said one of the most important things is more than just talking about living a virtuous life. You need to give them skills to get out of the bottom, or whatever you want to call it, however you want to phrase it. Get them into a position where there is some socioeconomic movement upwards, so that they don't need to be so the cycle can be broken. So that's when I first started thinking about that. And so when I was there, I was a missionary, and also I was a mentor for the youth, and I would, we would spend time together, and when I would hang out with them, I would try and get them to think about life more than just, okay, yeah, today I made money, so I don't need to really worry about tomorrow. Like, how do you essentially think from an entrepreneurial standpoint? And I mean, I guess when I think about it at the time, it's essentially trying to was trying to raise them to be good capitalists, which is now, but at the time it was more of like I was caught between a rock and a hard place. It's either that or some. So if you before you break the system, figure out how to work the system was how I was thinking about it. Before you break out of it, figure out how to work in it so you can actually give yourself a chance. So that's how I started thinking about it, was in that in when I was working there. I mean, it didn't really work out very well for me, just because that wasn't a priority it wasn't a priority because, and I'll give you another example. So it costs about $3,000, between $1,500, I'm going to be very conservative, $1,500 to $3,000 to travel for that trip per person. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, let's say 10 people go. 10 plus 15 that's $15,000, $30,000. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, what if you just raised the $30,000, you give them the money? That would be have way more potential than to send 20 people who are just going to do work and that it's going to be helpful, but it'll be way more helpful to send $30,000 that you can put into some kind of infrastructure that can be perpetuated through skills development, leadership, whatever you want to call it. So that's how I was thinking. I was like the very worst missionary you could have brought to that community, because I was thinking of how do we make it so that they don't really need us, that we can give them the skills. Like what they really need from Westerners is how Westerners think, how Westerners make, essentially just play the game. It's a game. You learn how to play the game, and you win. That's the whole Dave Ramsey thing. So my biggest, I guess, experience was that, where I really had a chance to do that, but the reality is that it didn't work out for me. And I remember talking to somebody in the bigger organization that we were in. I was talking to him about it, and I basically was like, okay, so if this is how things, like, we need to create a situation where they don't need, because right now this is very like dependent, like the dependency is essentially like indefinite. It's not ending. And he was like, yeah, I mean, that's the reality, but this is the way things are. And if you don't like it, you leave. So this is the way things are. It's not that things are going to change. It's that if you can't rock with this, then you got to get out of it. And I before this, we were talking about, Cornel West, and I've talked about Bonhoeffer and Black theology and all that. These are people that I learned from, that they're not, like just go with it people. So when I heard that, I was like, well, one of us has to go. And it was me. So that's the main experience I have with kind of coming against a big institution or some sort of institutionalized power. Now, mind you, at the same time, there were people that I met there that had the same mentality I did, and for whatever reason, they found a way to make things work. I'm still in contact with some of them, and they're doing things that are pretty awesome within that framework. And that's my problem, is the framework. Like, can we find a way to get out of that? But at the same time, without it, it's more of like, just do the best with what we got. So that's my bit, and it's more from the missionary standpoint. But I'll stop there.
No, thanks for sharing that. I think you kind of give more substance to the conversation that we had in episode 2 around charity and how it perpetuates, the system more than it actually helps us or helps people. And I'm curious because you referenced several times in this that you were helping them get out of something. I'm curious if there was ever teachings to you or understanding to you, or if the institution that you worked for ever highlighted, this group of folks that you were working with ever ask for help, or was it that help imposed on them?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So I think in a non-Western kind of context, it's not this, it's a bit different, where, socioeconomic disparity is just so great that it just changes the conversation a little bit. So in this sense, the help we were providing was actually very helpful. And let me, like, one of the things I'll back up and say is, I'm not going to say that none of what we were doing or what they were doing was good or helpful, or like a lot. It was. I mean, we were working with vulnerable populations, and some, like, a lot of the work we were doing was making a huge difference, because what some of the people were going to have if we weren't there was not good for anybody. So that work was good. So I'll put it like this. Sort of like what Matt was talking about last week with regards to, like, the ambivalence of the sacred, where it's kind of like there's sometimes the sacred is, and the divine is used, and it brings and it creates life-giving and positive influences in society, and sometimes it just doesn't. It does the opposite. I think it's the same with missionary work, because at the same time, in similar ways, I'm Kenyan, and so my grandfather and his generation was a part of the 60s, the independence movements, in where all the African countries, all decided, hey, let's be free. And the thing is that with colonialism, they were seeking independence from, it brought Christianity to the communities. It brought schools. It brought hospitals, and so there was benefits from that enterprise that was oppressive. But if you're dying because you don't have antibiotics, and you have antibiotics, and you can continue living and also have a better quality of life because you have medication or medicine, that's a positive. The problem is that the institution that brought that also took your land. And so I think that question, the way I'm understanding the question, did they ask for it? Not necessarily. However, Eswatini, for example, is a country that has an insane AIDS population, HIV/AIDS population. When I was there, it was the highest in the world the size of the population. I mean, it was an insane figure. I can't remember. I think it was like 53% or something. It was a very large number of the population that was HIV positive. So you come in and you provide hospitals, clinics. We had a clinic in the community. You create that, you give that infrastructure there, the food, the education. Kids are getting educated for no cost of them or their families. So the question is, like, do you have to ask for that? Or is it like, do you see that need and then you go and you fill it? The problem is the institution that goes and sees the need and fills it also brings in other things that you didn't ask for as well. The deal you're getting has, like, a lot of things that you have to take with the good, the social improvement because this was, I was thinking about in the show notes, the thing about the missionary enterprise is that social improvement has to be tied to evangelism and the efforts to increase the number of converts in the world. So that's how that works. Anyways, does that answer, or is that in the direction of your question?
Yeah. And yeah, I think you answered the question, and I think it's really, really fascinating, because when just in the sake of our conversation, when we talk about liberation, when we talk about social justice work, we slightly touched on agency on the last episode, individual agency, collective agency. And the reason I was kind of asking the question is, like, based, like, even on the comment that you made, is like when communities and people don't have antibiotics, do you have to ask permission to bring in that antibiotics? And I would lean on that as absolutely, because if you don't, it takes away dignity and agency from the people. People have a right to say no to treatment. People have a right to choose their destiny. And that goes back to, when we talk about liberation looks different for everybody and that we can't prescribe what liberation looks like. And so in that context, in that container is kind of where I'm just exploring, not to criticize, not to say what you did was wrong. We're not saying that the work is not needed and not beneficial for folks, because there are moments where people just don't know what they want and they need to be in that conversation. And I'm not saying that's what this situation is either, but I'm just acknowledging the full spectrum of it to bring it back to like, well, if we're in a conversation of what does justice look like, I think this is a great example. Is like not to right or wrong it, not to put it in those categories, but to explore it and say what does justice look like in the best case scenario of this example, knowing that we're all flawed and we're going to make mistakes in that process. But I think this is an opportunity to tease it out and just to explore that.
Yeah, and I think, Moak, you brought up there are a number of intersecting things that are happening in the situation, because I've done short-term missions because it's a part of certain Protestant church cultures to take like a 2-week victory vacation or whatever. And if we're talking about mission trips to South America or continental Africa or anywhere, I think there's a slight exploitative element in as much as people are going there and the trips are much more for the people going than it is about the helping they're offering, particularly in that short-term situation. Now, people who want to be international workers who go and work somewhere and they're there full time, I think that can be great. I'm not going to poo-poo on that, but I think, we know that there are some problems with with the way the missionary industrial complex is run, right? Because it's a market. To some extent, it's a market for providing a certain experience to a congregation. There's a consumeristic element to how a lot of missions is done. There's the problem of the history of colonialism. In some ways, you're sort of caught up in the middle of all these intersecting things. There's the reality of the history of colonialism. There's the problem of doing charity, but you need to do something. There's a need here. There's the problem of, charity as almost simply being a means to conversion, where maybe improving life is improving systems is secondary. There's the reality that the focus in a lot of Protestant circles isn't in improving systems. These evangelical spaces aren't interested in improving political, economic systems, right? Because they're doing charity. Also, the systems in continental Africa, just post-colonialism, just in the post-colonial era, they were in many ways intentionally underdeveloped. So there weren't the institutions or systems to create prosperity for these independent African nations that had themselves been economically exploited. So you're sort of caught trying to do, you and Jen both, good work, but you're inheriting a lot of historical issues. And in many ways, you have a hand tied behind your back, because what really needs to happen are these wider systemic changes, and you're not able to make them. So, I want to acknowledge the toughness of it while also naming some of these issues that you're addressing. But I'm imagining, too, in the mission organization we're working with, I'm guessing you were partnered with a local indigenous church?
Well, yes. But it was an interesting situation, which I think was great. Even just backing up, even before the start of the episode, the way that, just to point out the way that I think about this critique of the missionary enterprise, it's very similar to the way James Baldwin, I think, was quoted saying, I love America. That's why I have the right to criticize her endlessly. I think it's in that regard, because. And that's the thing, is that when Jen and I, even when we first started, when we started dating and the way that she describes her work was that she wanted to train everyone up so that she doesn't have to be there. She can just leave and they can take care of themselves. Or they can, and I don't mean that take care as in they need a caretaker, but rather it's a systemic thing. She wants to create the system to be one that doesn't require her presence. And that to me was so powerful. That's exactly what the missionary enterprise needs to be. It has to be one where the missionary enterprise has to have an end goal where it's no longer needed. The problem, like you say, Matt, is that it's perpetual. At this point, there's no telling when is it ever going to end? When the places that you go to short-term missions trips, when is it ever going to be a situation where you don't have to go? So the situation we were in was unique in that it had a the where we lived was it was a small mining town that was converted to essentially like a almost like a commune, where they had with all of the redeeming qualities and none of the wild stuff that communes are known for in their history. So they had small businesses, they had a school, a clinic, a resort lodge. Also had they had a program for vulnerable populations. So all of that inside and a church in one community. So, like, that to me is like, I'm like, okay, this is a way. The problem, like you say, is that there was no real plan for, okay, how can we do this for this community so that we can leave the community? And that to me was, I was like, well, what are we doing? Because when I think about colonial, like the history, my experience of colonialism from my parents and my grandparents, learning that part of what they had to do in order to receive, and as Jason goes to your point about like antibiotics and being able to refuse, is for my family, part of my family, in order to get care and to get some social improvement, they had to give up their ancestral religion, ancestral practices. But as many people know who have studied non-Western cultures, the ancestral practices include religion, culture, family, history, oral traditions. They had to give up all of that because it was demonic. And so then your family history is gone. All the oral traditions, the community history, the lore, the mythology, all of those things are gone, just so that you can have a school in your community. And that's my problem, is historically it's a one-way street of dependence, perpetual dependence. So when I went there, I just come off a seminary reading Cone and all this. I was the worst person that they could have wanted to come there, because I'm like, okay, this is great. I love what we're doing. Okay, so how are we doing this so that we can get out of here? Or even if we stick around, it's just more of a, like, I'm just here if you need help, but you got it. Y'all can take care of it. Y'all got it on your own. You don't need, I'm just here to just give a little guidance here and there, but y'all are the ones who are running this thing. That was my end goal, my end game, but but that's not very good. It didn't work when I was there.
So, Moke, what I'm hearing is the problem of paternalism, like, never went away.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very paternalistic environment,
that is very core to the missionary industrial complex. And I say that just understanding that there is some good coming out of that. However, it's
the reality is that both can be true.
Exactly. Yes.
And at the same time, and the missionary model is not unique to missions, or we see that happen in all charity organizations. There's a mindset that's saying, I think it's kind of funny that I'm going to say this in this podcast. There's a savior complex that's justified because there are good things that come with the bad, that people focus on the good things. And we replicate that without questioning it all the time in our own communities. When we work with other organizations, when we are trying to improve a situation, we do come from that space of, for the most part, a lot of organizations and groups come from is like, well, there's a problem over there. I'm equipped to fix that problem, so I'm going to go in to fix it and apply a fix to it. Yes. And the reason I brought kind of leaned on your example here is so we could tease it out, as mentioned earlier. There's the exit plan that you spoke about, that there is no exit plan, I think is also tied into how you get an exit plan, is that first conversation of asking permission, asking what they want, what you need. Do you want us to come and be partners in figuring this out? Because once you set that up, then the exit plan is not created by us, the outsiders or the people coming in. The exit plan is created by the people who lives are impacted and who actually live in it. They can say, oh, we no longer need you. And I say that in broad strokes. I'm sure to be more interpersonal than that. But I think the example that we use with the missionary work is something that we can apply the problems that we see within the missionary work, or the examples and the applications that we can apply in our community work. It's when we see that there's poverty, when we see that there's houselessness, when we see that there's issues that really tug at us and that we say want to fix. It's not to go and apply something. It's actually talking to the community who's impacted by that, learning what they actually want or need. Because us coming in assuming that they want to not be in this situation is removing their dignity, removing their own agency. And when we do that and we absorb their dignity and we absorb their agency, we become all decision makers and replicate that dependency that you spoke about. Because now we've created an environment that there is no escape for them, because we came with the answers versus we want to be in conversations about a solution.
And I should note, I mean, I do feel like some missions organizations are more keen to this than others. And you hear it, particularly in things like some people who do urban development, conversations around gentrification. Like the criticism of gentrification is like, well, wait, don't you want a Whole Foods here? It'll be great for your neighborhood. And it's like, well, no, like what we want is to have that community center reopened, because that gives our children somewhere to go and something to do. And so I know in some of the church circles I've run in that have been a bit more keen to these things, they'll talk about that, right? That even if you're coming in, if you're a church planter, if you're a missionary, you have people who come in, usually all wearing matching shirts, who come in thinking they know what a neighborhood's need is, dropping in and then going out, and it's like, what have you really done for us? Versus those who enter into a neighborhood and say, hey, is there a way we can help you? I think, and again, even with things like urban development, it's like, okay, what does the community actually need and want versus what we think they need? I think that that's great. And it makes me want to take a dig at a figure who did the opposite of this. So do you remember when George Floyd was killed, was murdered, and they had the vigil in Minneapolis? Well, there was a worship leader named Sean Foyt who came in to do this big worship thing and sort of kept on sort of disrupting like the vigil that was planned by the people who were actually in the community. And I remember thinking at the time, like, the problem here is that, in some ways he comes in with this colonialist mentality, like, I'm going to come in because this is what you need in this moment, when what he should have done was go to all the local churches, pastors, community leaders and said, is there something I can do to help you? And now there was a African national pastor working with him, but I think that there's another issue there, because like being African American and being an African national are two different like lived experiences. So there's also a dynamic there. But the colonialist mentality that says I'm coming in and telling you what you need was on full display with what Foyt was doing, right? And there's almost an entitlement there, because it's like, no, because I'm speaking the truth, so I get to like break in here and disrupt your moment because what I'm doing is more important. So there isn't that mentality of respect. I mean, it's of the same spirit, as the people Moki pointed out who said, if you want us to build this school, you have to give up your ancestral religion. It's that same type of mentality. And don't get me wrong, I'm a Christian. Do I think Jesus is Lord? Yes. Do I believe like metaphysically in that and like all that? Yes. But I can tell you, no good has ever come from like offering Jesus to people from a paternal place in terms of healthy human development and long-term faith. It needs to be from a place of powerlessness and of service to others. It can't come from this place of I'm breaking in to tell you what you need to know in this moment. I think that that's part of what we're touching on here. And I think what often goes wrong when Christians do missionary work, when they do any type of service work, when they do a spontaneous event that's basically just exploiting. Like there's almost there's an exploitative, Bakunin talks about this. There's an exploitative nature to this bringing of the word of God to people in this paternalistic way. Like when the Virginia Tech shootings happened, I remember talking to this one pastor at a conference, and he was like, yeah, Pat Robertson had me on the 700 Club because I was a pastor on the ground dealing with grieving students. And one of the things Pat had said to him was, I'm sure you just want to get up on a stage right now and just start preaching the gospel and telling everyone that the time is short and they need to accept Jesus. And this dude I was talking to was like, well, I mean, right now I'm pastorally concerned. These people went through this traumatic event and just need, pastoral help, counseling. We're here to listen. And Pat did this whole thing. It's like, this is the problem with these younger evangelicals, right? Like there's that element of not grieving with, but exploiting. Like there's something exploitative about it that I think whatever the inner intentions are, they might not mean to be exploitative, but they end up being exploitative because they're not giving people that agency, and they're not coming from a place of bottom up serving. They come from this place of we're coming to you from this superior paternalistic place. And I think that's a big problem. And Moki, I'm guessing part of what you were struggling with in your situation.
I mean, Willie Jennings in his book A Christian Imagination, great book. One of the points he makes about this paternalistic mindset is the thing about this kind of going in, kind of like coming upon this, the nation that needs God or whatever you may call it, is the learning. There's only one learner, the one to whom I am coming and descending upon, the one to whose shores I am coming to. He's talking about colonialism, which started this whole enterprise, and in a paternalistic relationship, like it's the old school kind of way of parenting is like that. As a parent, my child needs to learn from me, but I am not learning anything from my child. It's the same kind of dynamic where I am like, they have to learn from me. They have to learn the gospel. They have to learn about the ancestors. They have to learn about medicine. They have to learn about mathematics and science and sociology. But I don't need to learn anything from them. That's the biggest problem. Frantz Fanon has this one quote. I can't remember if it's in Wretched of the Earth, where he says that the one of the problems, the Negro problem, one of the issues is that, how do you say it? I can't remember exactly, but I'm paraphrasing. Like white people have nothing. They feel like they have nothing to learn from the Negro. There's no curiosity about that experience. It's essentially just like a non-entity. And so any kind of liberation is not about what they need, because they're just perpetual children or perpetual whatever you want to call them. That the learning only is always unidirectional. So for me, I remember one time when I was in Swaziland, and I was just kind of, it was middle of the day, and some people were waiting for the bus stop in our community. Now the bus didn't come very often, and so you could literally wait all day. I remember just seeing some guys, and like they weren't doing anything. They were just like kind of just hanging around, just kind of enjoying the day. And I'm like, shouldn't y'all be reading? I mean, can't you read something? Can't you, kind of exercise your mind? And because in my mind, I'm like, if you just sit here all day, you wasted a whole day. That's how I was looking at it. Now, in some ways, that could be true, but why can't it also be true that maybe they don't need, like, maybe you can just do that? Why can't that be your day? Why can't your day just be being in a place out in nature? The community we were in was very rural, but it was very, very beautiful. Enjoying the mountains, the mountainscape, enjoying the cool breeze coming on you, enjoying just regular conversation with the people around you. Why can't that be? Is that a waste of your day? And I remember that moment so clear because I was like, dang, literally, I was assuming that what I think is a productive use of your day is the norm. But why can't it be different? In a practical way, like all this stuff I was reading about came into play. Like, am I willing to learn? And even that goes into a different way of like, what does it mean to learn from someone? Do I need to be in a class with you, or can I just look at you, look at your life, look at your world, and see your world from your point of view in a way that makes me see my world differently? So,
yeah, I really like that. I really like that the conversation has shifted from what we think is needed, looking back of like what is the feedback that we're receiving. And it reminds me of a quote which I can't remember who said. I think it's been attributed to multiple people, but it says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together. And I think that's the reflection and the learning that is the core entry point to all of this. It's not that savior, I'm coming to help. It's because we can't flourish and succeed as a species, as humans, as living beings on this planet without each other.
Okay, I'm sort of intrigued. Well, go ahead. I don't know if you're about to respond to Jason.
well, I was thinking about the story of Jesus and the rich man, and where Jesus says to, he have this conversation with the rich man, and, he's like, what do I need to do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus gives him, obey the commandments and so on and so forth. Like basically all these things, like you've got to follow the law, the Torah and all of that. And he says, I've done all these things. And Jesus says, well, sell all your possessions and give them to the poor, and then come follow me. And it says, the famous phrase, the rich man walked away saddened. And then there's a whole story about that. As I've been thinking about that story as I've gotten older, is kind of to follow Jesus and kind of think about this, social improvement tied to conversion. The perpetual nature, the paternalistic nature of the missionary complex is tied to that. I don't want to bring or consider this the case that liberation could happen without me being in the terms of like the chain of causation. Your freedom is not necessarily tied. Your liberation is not necessarily tied to my liberation, but rather your liberation is because of me. And Jesus is saying, "You give it all. We'll go do our own thing. Let them figure it themselves out." He's like, "I can't do that. I need to have it. I need to have it my way. I gotta have the change. The impact has to be from my. It has to be tied to me, not tied to God is the one who does His work in the world, not us." And so, but as you say, it's like your liberation is tied to my liberation. It's like, for me, the way I think about, I'm processing that is that it's a mutual exchange. It's almost like synergistic, that I can't determine for you what you need and vice versa. But at the same time, our connection, our mutuality will influence liberation as it's happening for the both of us. Like there will be some kind of a transfer there, but it's not going to be one that's me lording over you or you lording over me.
Absolutely. Let me respond real quick, Matt. I really love that, because what you said is that it's not, can't remember exact terms. You said that I can't know what your liberation looks like. And going back to what you were saying about that feedback loop is, and how it's bound together. I think how it's bound together is I'm never going to know what liberation looks like to you until we're in that conversation and you're telling me. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the mission work and the other charity work, is that you're not going to have an exit plan. You're not going to have the success and create that environment where liberation can flourish without being in that conversation, without hearing and listening and saying, what is it that you need? What is it that you're missing? What is it that you need to fully flourish? And then not for me to hear that and say, oh, I have an answer for you. It's to me to hear that and say, well, how do we build that together? Knowing that end result benefits both of us in a level that is not, logical, or in a level that's not on pen and paper where you create the plan, but it creates something greater. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No. I just wanted to highlight, Moki. I'm really struck by the comment you made about the problem of unidirectional learning, and particularly you connected it to. I mean, we can connect it to a lot of places, but but when we're talking about missionary work or Africa or anything like that, like there's an element of racial hierarchy here happening. There's an element of racial paternalism happening. So I thought the notion that the key problem that we've highlighted is the problem of unidirectional learning. That Fanon, as you highlighted again, said that the white man doesn't think he has anything to learn from the black man. And I just thought of experiences. I wrote down some different examples where you see this. And then the last one I have here actually isn't about race. It's about child rearing. But I remember in a church I was involved in, the one where I had my really negative experience I talked about in episode 1. I remember making a comment that I was with my boss, who was just really sort of wanted to work everyone to the bone. And I mentioned, well, you have this like really hard, overzealous work ethic, but think about these. I was reflecting on people in other parts of the world, Moki, the people you're talking about, who are like, you don't have to squeeze productivity out of every moment of the day. Like sometimes you can just be. And that it actually provides time for maybe a more robust sense of community and all this other stuff. And I said that I brought that up, particularly the part about maybe community is more important than productivity. And he was like, yeah, but, and he was just very dismissive. It's like, yeah, but their countries aren't developed and built. I mean, it was like a whole thing, but it's like, they're struggling to get by. Their countries aren't built up. So it's like, I think when you look at, America and the way we work, like, we actually have all this fruit to show from it. So there was just that I mean, it wasn't even that's a good point, but what about this? It was dismissiveness, right? Or I think about how I remember the first time I discovered that black Christians don't vote the same way white Christians do, and a majority of them vote Democrat. This is a big deal during the George W. Bush, Al Gore election. And it's like, okay, over the years, it got me thinking, like, okay, is there something here I'm missing? Because, like, if they're Christians the way we're Christians, and it was interesting, the dismissal, there's nothing to learn there. There's no sense in which, as some people have talked about in U.S. history, that the black community is sort of the conscience of the U.S. or whatever. It was sort of like, well, that's just because they've been bribed and bought off through being given welfare. Like, there's nothing to learn. Right. And then I think of someone like Sean Foyt coming in. And you know what? I don't mind a worship service being done or whatever. Like, that's not my thing for going after Foyt. But I think there are two problems. One is that rather than being a part and seeing how he could participate with the community, talking to leaders, talking to other local church pastors, particularly black church pastors in that community, to see how he could come in, rather than learning, right, is that he comes in, it's unidirectional again. And I think not only in the fact that I don't think there was the type of community engagement that needed to happen, but rather this sort of old school idea of a missionary dropping in to bring the kingdom. But also, I don't think Sean felt like he needed to listen to understand black grievance because looking at his politics and looking at everything else, I don't think he thinks that black grievance is based in reality. I don't think he really thinks there's a problem of over policing of black communities or of systemic racism or all of the stuff that George Floyd's death was highlighting. I don't think he thought he had anything to learn politically, socially, or otherwise. So unidirectional. And then the other thing I was thinking, I think you mentioned parents, like, the problem of parents being unidirectional and thinking they have nothing to learn from their kids. So there's definitely a sense in which, even the most liberated person might say, okay, children do need guidance, though, because they're developing. Like, we're not saying children don't need guidance, but there is a problem with an authoritarian parent. I was just reading this book by Chris Hansen called Open and Relational Parenting, which I bought for a few different reasons, but one was because I sometimes find myself having to deal with certain authoritarian parents who, with adult children or whatever, no one specifically, authoritarian parents who still think that everything flows unidirectionally. And what's interesting about Chris's book is, in part, he's adopting what's called open and relational theology, which, among other things, sees God as involved in a relationship of mutuality and reciprocity with creation, which he then says becomes a model for parenting in terms of not, you can still offer guidance, direction. Obviously, when kids are younger, you might need to be more prescribed, but like you still find ways of elevating their sense of agency. So it's like, okay, you have these three choices or something, right? But you also allow yourself to be responsive to what your kid is saying rather than assuming you understand everything and have the plan, as though there's nothing to learn from what your kid is saying, as though there's no correction to be given there, particularly when your kids are adults. Like I said, not highlighting anyone in particular, but I was reading this book because I was like, okay, what might open and relational parenting look like? Never mind for kids who are underage, but if you're parenting, step parenting adult children, like what does that look like? And it was nice to read a book that confirmed, everything I thought about what parenting should look like. But he really goes against, the authoritarian parent. It's, again, unidirectional. There's nothing to learn. And this is where I'm glad I've listened to people like, Jason Upton, who Muoki, I know you know who that is. It's like his whole thing is, what do his kids have to teach him? Right? What has been forgotten? What has been lost that a child can teach me? Right? Rather than getting so full of myself that I think I see the whole picture. But yeah, that unidirectional learning element you brought up, I felt was something I wanted to highlight that I think is really important, and might even be, since we're coming up near an hour, even our takeaway about what it means to be involved in justice, whatever organization we find ourselves in, wherever, whatever activity we're a part of. That part of that work does involve, it cannot be unidirectional. It has to be mutual. It has to involve reciprocity. It has to involve listening. It has to involve respect for the other person's agency. It has to involve hearing what they need and learning from them. That's part of what justice looks like. So if you're approaching justice from in a paternalist way, or any good work you think you're doing, the danger of paternalism is right there.
Jason, there's something that you've mentioned. I can't remember if it was the last conversation we had or the first one, about how the work that you do, the Radical Guide, is this notion of, how do you describe them what term do you use for the listings you have? You call them,
I'll call them liberation spaces.
Liberation spaces. And there's one thing you said, like, you're not responding to a crisis. You're looking at liberation as it's almost like this is the state that you need to be. This is something that is not like, there's no savior here. This is what life should be like. And just curious about that, because as I was thinking about this conversation today, the missionary not only complex, maybe the missionary kind of context or conversation that I've grew up in for the most part, which is where liberation is mostly tied, in some way, is responding to like the crisis that the world needs Jesus. And I don't want to minimize that as though it's not something that's important, because I still believe, and I believe that this kind of way does have a lot of positive impact. But there is a sense of urgency, you know, kind of the Jesus is coming, you know, even Jason Upton is also very, very big on this too. So there is like this, always like this sense of like restlessness in what we're doing, and like a sense of like time is running out. Is that how, or how is a radical guy different? How does liberation work in that sense? How are these liberation spaces like functioning without this sense like time is running out? Or is that also a part of it?
No, I mean, there's a spectrum. So let me say this: if I oversimplify where we come from, the foundation of every approach, everything that we do is about relationship, being in relationship, and the manifestation of being in a relationship produces mutual aid. And there's a whole conversation that we could have of what is mutual aid, but I won't go into. I think crisis and urgency is language of the oppressor. Because when you apply urgency and crisis in that sense, you control a narrative in the sense that you can control actions. And if you remove urgency and crisis and go back to relationship, you're building something different. There may be times that you have to move quickly. You know, I can't think of an example now, but there may be times. But that urgency and that moment is not defined by outside forces. It's defined with the people who are impacted. So when you lead with crisis, when you lead with urgency, you're changing the whole narrative, and you're not even putting relationship in it. You're coming in with a prescribed plan. And so because there's a spectrum, and because language is limited, the way that you ensure that you don't fall into the authoritarianism aspect of urgency or stuff is still deeply rooted in community. It's deeply rooted into, oh, am I impacted with this? Are you impacted by this? If the answer is yes to both, then the question comes up is like, well, what have we learned about this, and what do we need to create to get out of it? If the answer is not yes to both, but yes to one, then the one who answers no is not to come up with the solutions. It's like, you're the one that impacted. You understand the situation far better than I do. What do you believe is needed to move forward? And I think this goes back to what y'all both brought up about white folks not wanting to see the lived experiences of the Black community within the United States and elsewhere. Because just in social justice work, there's always people who are like, I don't need to learn this because I'm already aware of this. And that stems from fear of losing something, fear of, if I do actually learn this, then I'm going to have to change. I'm going to lose my status, learn my privilege, whatever it is that they fear in losing. And I lost my train of thought. There's another part that I was going with it, but I'll pull it back to what I was saying. Urgency and crisis, while can be true, it's the intent behind it. It's where it generates from is where it becomes potentially problematic or potentially helpful. And that, in my mind, stems from relationship, not from outside sources. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that tracks.
You say that all the time, like I'm seeking trackness.
The essence of trackness. So you can't remember what that second point was, can you?
No, I think I was just going to rabbit hole the problems with folks. I don't know. I really have no idea where I was going with it.
That tracks. See what I did there? All right. Any final thoughts, comments here, fellas?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, but no, I don't have anything. I was going to rabbit hole something, but I'm stepping back.
That tracks.
Damn you.
You gave me a tool now. You gave me a weapon. That's what you just gave me. All right. Well, thank you, everyone who tuned in today. And of course, as always, thank you to my co-host, Muoki Masao, Jason Bayless. So thank you for tuning in. I actually don't know how to land the plane. Which track?
Well, let's see if we can track it. I think what we've covered. Let me help. If that's needed.
Yeah. No, I mean we are in relationship, so
Yeah.
thank you. Yes,
Mutual aid.
But I think
I'll take your help.
I think that being in relationship is what we learned today. I think the whole arc of what we're looking at is like really looking at how do we manifest what justice looks like in the world? How do we embrace that? What do we learn from? And I think what we've learned from this episode, at least for what I've learned from this episode, we've all been in different spaces that have improved the world to varying degrees. And what we realize that in those processes, that there's also, that can be true at the same time, that it's built within a system that is not beneficial for all. So because it's built in that system, the good that we produce is sometimes tainted. That doesn't undermine the good. It pushes us to require us to look at the system in which it was built. And what we ended up with Muoki's question to me is like, well, what does that system look like if we remove it? If we build it outside of that system, where's our starting ground? Where's our beginning spaces? How can we actually start thinking and looking and manifesting this in a different space? And I think where we landed, and which I think in our heart we're always known, and we're just naming it, is it begins with true relationship, not superficial, not one way, but a mutual relationship of understanding, listening, hearing, and collaboration. And so maybe in the next episode, we can expand that even more and talk about how does that show up. Anyway, that's what I learned. I don't know if that's what we need.
This is like the end of a South Park episode. I learned something today.
Yes. And Kenny's dead.
And Kenny's dead. Yeah, no, real old school South Park.
Works for me.
All right.
Well, listeners, thank you for tuning in. And we'll
See you next time.
The most
See you
awkward
next time.
episode ever. I'm out of here.